bringing me here to the hub of delegitimization. This is my first talk in London. And as Michael said, I was at the Russell Tribunal. So I'm going to talk about, really briefly, try to run through some of the things I discussed there, but hopefully put this in a wider context. I hope this is legal. I just heard Theresa May's talk, and I know that there's some ban on hate preachers, so hopefully that seems like a really wide definition. Hopefully I don't fit in there. I wrote some notes on this new book by Patrick Coburn on ISIL, or the Islamic State, in Iraq and the Levant, but we're going to talk about the Jewish state in Israel and the Levant, also known as JSIL. I think we should actually start referring to it as such. So I mean, everyone's still in shock from what happened in Gaza. It was 51 days of unrelenting bloodshed. I was there for 2 weeks, starting on October 14th, which was the beginning of a 5-day ceasefire. So I was able to get kind of unfettered access to the people who had just returned to their homes, which had been reduced to rubble, in the border areas, which comprise nearly 25% of the Gaza Strip, and then you tack on all of the buffer areas they're not allowed to enter. They live in a tough neighborhood. They live next to Israel, so they're constantly being terrorized. And you know, before I take you there, we have to understand the context of the war, and this is what I tried to do with my book, which explains what happened since Israel elected the most right-wing government in its history in 2009. The context of the war was the collapse of the Kerry Framework Agreement, which finalized the death knell of the peace process and left Israel exposed. Netanyahu has always said that his goal is to maintain the occupation, and now that's been exposed. It's clear that that's what he intends to do. After that, there was the way that the peace process collapsed, or the framework agreement collapsed, is interesting because it collapsed around a negotiation around a prisoner release. Netanyahu was supposed to release a third batch of prisoners of Palestinian prisoners in order to extend the negotiations. Avigdor Lieberman, the foreign minister of the right-wing Yisrael Beitenu party, and Naftali Bennett of the right-wing Jewish Home Party, a party that favors a unitary apartheid state and the end of the Oslo process, something I'm prepared to go for. Maybe I should make Aliyah and vote for him. They stopped this release of Palestinian prisoners and killed the peace process. Netanyahu went ahead and authorized new settlements. Martin Indyk, a former staffer for AIPAC, the key arm of the Israel lobby, blamed Israel, went to Israeli media to blame Israel, an unprecedented step, and Israel was completely exposed. Then Abbas and Haniya went ahead and signed the unity government deal, which threw Netanyahu into a petulant frenzy, and he was seeking ways to reestablish international legitimacy while being exposed with this permanent occupation and undermining the Palestinian unity government. So you have the kidnapping of 3 teens. This occurs on June 12th. 3 Israeli teens were kidnapped in the occupied West Bank by a rogue Hamas cell. It's been clearly established there were no orders from Hamas's top political cadre. This was not an orchestrated operation. However, these two, the figures who were behind this operation, were seeking to generate a prisoner swap because of that third batch of prisoners who were not released. So in other words, the right wing's pressure on Netanyahu and the collapse of the peace process did lead to, may have led to this incident. Netanyahu and the Shin Bet and the Israeli police were aware that the teens were killed right away. Recordings of the teens from their cell phone, in which gunshots were heard, were provided to Netanyahu. The parents of the teens heard the gunshots, and the Shin Bet told them those were not gunshots, they were blanks. They lied to the parents and said there was no DNA or blood in the car when DNA and blood were found in the burned getaway car. The teens were buried in a shallow grave on the property of Marwan Kawazme, one of the kidnappers. In fact, the Israeli police had raided the homes of Kawazme and Abu Aisha, his accomplice, and brought the family members in for interrogation. immediately after the kidnapping occurred, and nobody in the Jewish Israeli public or in the Israeli public knew because the entire investigation was placed under a gag order. So in other words, Netanyahu knows that the teens are dead, but then authorizes, on the one hand, a global PR campaign to elicit sympathy for Israel under the Bring Back Our Boys hashtag, modeled after the Bring Back Our Girls. And on the other hand, a major operation throughout the West Bank to arrest everyone even remotely affiliated with Hamas, to re-arrest 100 people who were released in the Gilad Shalit prisoner swap, including Hadar Adnan and Samurai Sawi, who led these heroic hunger strikes. They raided Birzeit University. I mean, it was an attempt to completely dismantle Hamas and dismantle the unity government, with Abbas playing along. PA security forces assisting Israeli security forces in Ramallah. Hamas is watching this with a lot of anger. Hamas does not authorize rockets into Israel. However, splinter factions in the Gaza Strip do. The Popular Resistance Committees, there are Islamic Jihad. Hamas didn't launch rockets until July 10th, after 7 members of its top military cadre were killed in an Israeli strike. Operation Brother's Keeper, the fake Netanyahu rescue operation, a fake Netanyahu-ordered rescue operation, which was actually a political operation and a military operation to retrench Israeli control over the West Bank, morphs into Operation Protective Edge, which I think, Hebrew speakers can correct me, but I think in Hebrew it translates as Operation Steep Cliff. So this is when Israel...
No, it doesn't translate that. It's completely different words.
Strong, sharp cliff.
It means a strong... hard rock. Yeah, hard rock, which is also funny.
Massive. I've heard different things.
Totally different name. They didn't try to translate.
Right.
They have completely different political aims.
Okay. Well, that's still interesting. So, as this is happening, as Israel authorizes Protective Edge, right prior to it, the teens' bodies had been discovered. And it was very curious to me that these teens' bodies were sitting in a shallow grave on the property of one of the kidnappers whose names the Israeli government already had. They have superior mapping capabilities in the West Bank. They have satellites monitoring everything. They have collaborators on every corner. The Shin Bet has the West Bank on total lockdown. And it was hitchhiker volunteers who found the bodies 2 weeks later. Netanyahu emerges from a cabinet meeting and declares that the blood of a small, revenge for the blood of a small child, Satan has not yet created. Quoting from a poem, a turn-of-the-century poem by the Hebrew poet Chaim Bialik, referring to a pogrom in the Pale of the Settlement. Netanyahu is invoking the darkest days of Jewish history and calling for blood vengeance against Palestinians. He said, all of Hamas is responsible. So he's not just foreshadowing war on Gaza, he's opening the breach of a society that is seething with bloodlust. Death to Arabs mobs emerge in Jerusalem. Mohammed Abu Khudair is captured by 3 of the participants in one of these Death to Arabs mobs. He is a 19-year-old kid from Shufat. Gasoline is doused, his body's doused with gasoline. That gasoline is poured down his throat. He's burned alive. Shufat, his neighborhood explodes. For the first time in Jerusalem since the Second Intifada, guns are displayed openly and fired at his funeral. East Jerusalem is still in open revolt. The first, and so you have the incitement building in Israeli society, and also the mobilization against leftist dissenters. The first rocket that was fired, authorized by Hamas, at least as it's understood in Shufat in East Jerusalem, was fired towards Jerusalem. It's an M75. And so it was understood as a retaliation to the killing of Abu Khudair, as an act of resistance. So the war begins. Lieberman, Avigdor Lieberman, is trying to channel the mood of the public in Israel. And if you went on Israeli social media, you would see a lot of Israeli pre-army teens, this is summertime, complaining that their summer vacations have been interrupted by rockets and by sirens and calling for genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. My colleague David Sheen produced a storify exposing this. And so Lieberman says the only way our teens can have a proper summer vacation is through a ground invasion in Gaza. That was about 7 days before the ground invasion began. The ground invasion began really in the border areas, Shujaiya, which is one of them. In Shujaiya, the Israeli troops entered in light armor. They weren't expecting resistance. Hamas had been preparing, the Al-Qassam brigades had been preparing for this fight. They entered in M115 armored personnel carriers, which the US used in Vietnam. Light armor. I think they were hit with a Cornet missile, Cornet rocket. 5 to 7 soldiers were killed. One was possibly captured for a time, Oron Shaul. And Israel invoked the Hannibal Directive. The Hannibal Directive is a semi-secret military policy which allows the military to target not just the captors of a soldier, but possibly the soldier himself, killing the soldier in order to prevent a politically controversial prisoner swap, like the kind we saw with Gilad Shalit. And in order to do that, you don't necessarily know where the soldier is, you just know which area he's in. So you attack the entire perimeter with everything. And so I interviewed people in Shujaiya who told me that they knew something had happened, that a soldier had been taken because F-16s began dumping their entire payload on the neighborhood. They were attacked simultaneously.